This week, we're concluding our reading of Regeneration. I've put the last half of the book in the context of Trudy Tate's essay, Tanks and the Manufacturing of Consent, because Barker is very interested in how societies maintained consent for the war effort after 1916, when most scholars agree the horrors of the Somme utterly changed how both soldiers and civilians thought about the war. For instance, by 1917, many people on both sides no longer thought the war was winnable, but they did think that their nations and they personally had invested so much in the fight already that it was impossible to give up. Tate sheds light on events before the tanks were first deployed in the Battle of the Somme to show how the British government worked to encourage support for the war effort. In many ways, the strategies Tate describes in her essay are typical of what governments do during wartime to encourage certain kinds of patriotism that translate into support for the war. Let's start with money. Wars are expensive. Governments who fight them generally have to borrow from their citizens in order to afford the costs. Take a minute to Google war bond posters and see what images come up. These are posters produced by various governments in various wars to encourage citizens to finance the war through the purchase of bonds. These posters are meant to be emotionally manipulative. I gave a man. Will you give at least 10% of your pay to war bonds? Is he your child? You don't want this. Child is wearing a Nazi cap. Buy war bonds before it is too late. Tate is describing a more fun and less guilt-ridden war bond campaign using the new secret weapon the British were developing, the tank. Strategically, the tank was necessary for the Great War. Trench warfare meant that the great challenge of the war was achieving mobility, and a functional tank would provide a way to get soldiers out of the trenches and on the attack. Tanks replaced horses as the cavalry for the army, the units that punched through enemy lines and opened ways for the infantry to advance. In fact, tanks were so desirable as weapons by 1916 that they were deployed before their designs were fully tested, leading to the debacle Tate describes on the first day of the Somme battle. But Tate is also interested in their psychological meaning for civilians, the hope they created that they would lead to a breakthrough on the bloody Western Front. Of course, that hope gets mixed up with other kinds of pleasures, and so we see scenes like the gleeful challenges to save money through the tank bank, and so on. Barker shares Tate's interest in the civilian population during the war. Part of the reason for this has to do with the life experience that led her to begin working on regeneration. Her grandfather continued to be haunted by the war to the end of his life, though he never talked about it. Empathy for her grandmother, who supported her war-damaged husband through the many years he lived after returning from the Western Front, made her understand that while books about the war tended, understandably, to focus on the experience of combatants, the war's effects were actually much broader than that. That is why, for instance, Sarah is such an important character in Regeneration. And that's also why a scene, like the scene when Sarah accidentally walks into the conservatory filled with grievously injured men, is so emblematic of how Barker's text differs from those written contemporaneously. In 1914 to 1918, the idea of concealing those with physical disabilities was widely accepted, particularly in better-off families. The government's form of caring for soldiers with gross physical injury during the war thus brought together two social ideas: that the injured were unsightly, and that it would be doing a service to society to conceal them from it, and that it was vitally necessary to keep civilians believing that the war was winnable and the costs reasonable. Put this in the context of the tank bank. Who would put their money in if the slogan read, "Good money after bad"? We can see the conservatory full of maimed soldiers as an act of deception that is predicated on a social stigma against the physically disabled, and Sarah, who is more our contemporary than Sassoon's or Rivers's, sees it the same way. Now connect what Rivers thinks when he visits Burns and has to rescue him from the Martello Tower the night of the big storm. Nothing is worth this. Nothing, 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 he thinks to himself. Again, Rivers ought to know pretty well the true cost of the war. He works every day with men who have been shattered by the war, whose futures are bleaker because of what the war has done to them. But when he rescues Burns, he has to admit it to himself, the total breakdown of personality that he can understand when he compares the man he knows with the boy and young man represented in the cottage. The cost of war isn't just deaths and maiming, losses in families and in communities. It is also the lost future of a man like Burns, a man so able he had been promoted captain at 20. He shares this accomplishment with Edmund Blunden. All World War I novels are in some sense anti-war novels. Because of the nature of that war, it's almost impossible to imagine writing another kind of novel about it. And Barker definitely picks up that feeling here. Just as Sassoon's declaration against the war wanted his government to reckon and account for the true cost of the war, Barker insists that in thinking about war, one must understand what it means on the personal, individual level for combatants and survivors alike. Barker uses these two important scenes, as well as others, to connect the war combat memoir with the lives of civilians. She also uses other scenes from civilian life, which generally feature soldiers being furious at civilians for their inability to understand the suffering of soldiers, and for generally going on with life as if nothing much has changed, even as everything has changed for the combatants. One of these scenes is when Sarah and Billy go to the beach, and he becomes filled with anger against the day trippers heading out to enjoy the sand and sun. Another, much later in the book, is when Sassoon visits the club and becomes furious with the old man sitting there discussing the war, a scene he discusses with Rivers in one of his therapy sessions. This latter scene should remind us of Rivers at the beginning of Part 3, when he visits his brother and attends church while on leave. You probably recall his looking at the stained glass portrayal of Abraham and Isaac, and his thoughts about how the covenant between the old man and the young had been broken by the war. Barker uses a poem by Owen as the background of this scene. The Parable of the Old Man and the Young is a poem that was not published in Owen's lifetime. He really only had a couple of poems published before he died, though he was preparing a book for publication when he was killed in action 1 week before the armistice. Here is the poem. So Abram rose, and clave the wood, and went, and took the fire with him, and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake, and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. You can see that the poem starts out following the story of Abraham and Isaac that you may remember from Genesis. But this poem takes a dark turn fairly quickly. Abram has no interest in sparing his son. The process of binding him and of building parapets and trenches there moves the poem away from a mere retelling and into a metaphor for the war itself. When the angel appears and directs the old man to offer the ram instead of the boy, the ram is explicitly labeled the ram of pride. In other words, Owen argues in this poem that all that would be necessary to save the young boy is to slay pride instead. This is impossible for the old man to do, however. He loves his pride more than he loves his son. And Owen extends the metaphor. Abram in this poem does not just kill his son, but half the seed of Europe, one by one. This poem captures the sense by national leaders in all the combatant nations that they had no choice but to fight this war. It also captures the sense of soldiers that once in it, they were so bogged down by pride that they were unable to look at the situation rationally, and so kept fighting despite the unlikeliness that the war effort could be salvaged. Owen then, like Sassoon, is arguing here for a quick end to the war, one that would involve a loss of face for all national leaders, the old men, but that would save the lives and the futures of countless young soldiers. a swift end to the war. That's what everyone wanted. It's what the national leaders knew was unlikely to happen in 1916 and 1917. It's what the tank promised, though it took a few years to live up to that promise. And the failure of the combatant nations to negotiate a peace early on in the war, when it was apparently a stalemate, is the cause of the suffering that Barker was still inscribing in her text, written 80 years after the Great War.